You don't know what a real deployment is like, honey. Let the men talk. My husband said it with a laugh, one hand on his colleague's shoulder, in a ballroom full of his company's biggest clients, on a night his firm had specifically built around honoring veterans. He said it 2 feet away from me, in the black dress I'd bought for exactly this kind of evening, and he never once looked back to see my face when the room chuckled along with him. I didn't correct him. Not yet. But here's what my husband, and every single person in that ballroom, didn't know yet about the woman standing quietly by the bar with a glass of club soda she hadn't touched. This is silent revenge, where the quietest person in the room is usually the one who's already seen more than everyone laughing. If you know what it's like to be underestimated by someone who should have known better, stay with me tonight. Drop a comment and subscribe. I'm Major Renata Osei, United States Army, retired. I'm 39 years old, and for 14 years I served as an intelligence officer, including 2 deployments to Afghanistan and 1 to Iraq, the second of which ended with me pulling 2 soldiers out of a burning Marab after an IED strike outside Kandahar, an action that earned me a Bronze Star with Valor device that I have never once hung on a wall in my own home, because I never needed a wall to know what happened out there. I grew up in a modest house outside Columbus, Ohio, the daughter of a Ghanaian immigrant father who drove a delivery route for a beverage distributor and an American mother who taught middle school math, neither of whom had any military background at all. I enlisted at 19, mostly because ROTC offered the only realistic path to the kind of education my family couldn't otherwise afford. And I remember, distinctly, sitting in a recruiter's office in Columbus, telling him I wanted to do something that actually mattered, something with weight to it, and him nodding like he'd heard that line 100 times, which he probably had. What I didn't expect, walking in at 19, was how completely the work would end up defining the person I became. My father, in particular, had complicated feelings about my enlistment that took him years to fully articulate to me. He'd come to the United States in his 20s with almost nothing, had spent decades doing physically demanding, largely invisible work that nobody at his own company ever thought to ask him about beyond the basic logistics of his route. And I think some part of him recognized, watching me commission, that I was walking into a version of the same pattern: extraordinary effort, largely unwitnessed, in service of something larger than myself. He drove 4 hours to attend my commissioning ceremony and cried through the entire thing, and I remember him telling me afterward, in the parking lot, that he hoped the Army would actually see me in a way his own employer, after 22 years, never fully had. I think about that hope often now, turning it over against everything that happened in that ballroom, wondering what he'd make of a 2-star general finally saying, in front of a room of strangers, exactly the kind of thing my father had always wanted someone in a position of authority to say about his own daughter. I commissioned as a military intelligence officer after finishing my degree, and by the time I deployed to Afghanistan the first time, at 26, I already understood something most people never have to learn about intelligence work. It isn't glamorous, and it almost never looks like anything you'd see in a movie. It's hours spent poring over signals, data, and human intelligence reports, building a picture of enemy movement one fragment at a time, the kind of work that saves lives precisely because nobody ever sees it happen. My first deployment was 13 months of exactly that kind of invisible labor, and I came home from it changed in ways I didn't fully understand until my second deployment forced me to understand them all at once. The second deployment, the one that ended at Kandahar, was different from the start. I was running intelligence for a brigade operating in a genuinely hostile stretch of territory, coordinating convoy routes, flagging pattern-of-life anomalies that more than once kept vehicles off roads that turned out, days later, to have been seeded with pressure plate IEDs. I want to be honest that most of what I did over there never involved anything close to direct combat. That's the actual truth of intelligence work, and it's part of why Desmond's flattening of it into support side always stung in a particular, specific way. Because the label wasn't entirely inaccurate, it was just missing the one night that changed everything, the night that made the difference between a career of careful, unglamorous analysis and a Bronze Star with a Valor device I never talk about at parties. The night outside Kandahar started as a routine convoy escort, 3 vehicles moving supplies between forward operating bases along a route I had personally flagged as elevated risk 2 days earlier, based on a pattern of local movement my team had picked up in signals traffic. Command moved the convoy anyway, on a compressed timeline neither of us controlled, and I rode in the second vehicle specifically because I wanted eyes on the ground for the exact stretch of road I'd flagged. The IED hit the lead map at 2:14 in the morning, and I remember the sound before I remember anything else. A concussive wall of noise that seemed to arrive from every direction at once, followed by the specific, terrible silence that comes right after, before anyone starts screaming. I got out of my own vehicle and reached the lead mess wrap within maybe 90 seconds, though it felt considerably longer, and I found the door jammed and fire already climbing along the underside of the frame. Sergeant Alvarez was pinned against his own harness, disoriented, bleeding from a gash along his hairline, and Specialist Diaz was unconscious in the seat beside him. I don't remember making a decision to go in. I remember the door giving way after the third pull, the heat coming off the frame hot enough to blister the inside of my forearm, and I remember getting my hands under Alvarez's arms and pulling him clear before going back in for Diaz, who came to just enough, halfway through, to help me drag his own weight the last few feet before the fire fully reached the cab. 11 seconds. That's how long General Vance's report later clocked the gap between pulling Alvarez clear and going back in for Diaz. 11 seconds in which I had to decide whether the fire had already made that second trip impossible. I still think about those 11 seconds more than almost anything else from those 14 years. None of that meant anything to Desmond Ferris. My husband, Desmond, is a commercial insurance broker, a warm, likable man I met 4 years ago at a mutual friend's barbecue, 3 years after I'd transitioned out of the Army and started a quieter second career consulting on risk assessment for logistics companies. Desmond had never served. His own father had done a single stateside stint in the National Guard decades earlier, weekend drills and a summer of basic training he still, somehow, referenced at dinner parties as though it carried the same weight as anything I'd actually lived through. I want to be clear that I never once resented Desmond for not serving. Plenty of good people build good lives without ever putting on a uniform. What I resented, slowly, over 4 years of marriage, was the particular way Desmond had decided, without ever fully asking me, that my service was a smaller, gentler version of real military experience. Something closer to an extended camping trip, with better logistics than to anything that belonged in the same conversation as the stories he'd absorbed from his father's guard buddies at family reunions. It started small, the way these things always do. At our engagement dinner, Desmond introduced me to his uncle, a Vietnam-era veteran, by saying, "Renata was in the Army too," sort of the desk side of things, a description that flattened 14 years, 2 combat deployments, and a Bronze Star into something resembling an HR position. I corrected him gently that first time, told his uncle I'd actually served as an intelligence officer with 2 combat deployments, and Desmond had laughed it off later that night as me getting technical, as though naming my own service accurately was some kind of overcorrection rather than simply the truth. It got worse in small, accumulating ways I let slide because I told myself unpacking every mischaracterization would make me the difficult one at every party we ever attended. At a 4th of July gathering 2 years ago, Desmond's father held court about his own guard weekends, and when someone asked if I'd served too, Desmond answered before I could, saying, "Yeah, she did some overseas stuff, admin mostly," and I sat there with a beer in my hand, watching a room full of people nod politely at a description that had nothing to do with pulling 2 men out of a burning vehicle while rounds were still coming in. Desmond's father, Gerald, deserves a mention here, because he was, in his own way, the source code for the whole pattern. Gerald had spent 2 summers and a handful of weekend drills with the Ohio National Guard back in the early 80s, had never deployed anywhere, had never seen anything resembling combat, and had nonetheless built an entire persona around that brief stint, complete with a framed photo in his den and a set of stories he'd clearly polished over 4 decades of retelling. I don't begrudge Gerald his pride in that service. Even stateside guard duty deserves respect, and I've always been careful to say so. What troubled me was watching Desmond absorb, from childhood, a template in which military service was primarily a performance for an audience, a set of stories you told at dinner parties to earn a certain kind of admiration, rather than something that had actually cost anyone anything. Desmond had grown up believing his father's polished weekend warrior stories represented the emotional center of what military service meant, and when he met a woman whose actual service didn't fit neatly into dinner party anecdotes, he seemed, unconsciously, to shrink it down to a size that felt more familiar and manageable to him. I called my closest friend from the service, a former captain named Deja Whitlock, who'd done a tour alongside me in Iraq and now ran a nonprofit helping veterans transition to civilian careers, the week before the gala, mostly just to vent about having to attend another one of Desmond's firm's events. I told her about the 4th of July comment, about the engagement dinner years earlier, about the accumulated weight of 4 years of admin mostly. "Renata, you know I love you," Deja said, in the particular tone she reserved for moments she thought I needed to actually hear something, rather than just be comforted. "But you've been telling me these stories for 4 years, like they're funny. They're not funny. You let a man who's never worn the uniform decide, out loud, in front of strangers, what your service was worth. I'm not saying blow up his work party. I'm saying stop deciding, every single time, that his comfort matters more than the truth." I didn't have a good answer for her that night, other than the same tired justification I'd been offering myself for years, that it wasn't worth the fight, that Desmond didn't mean it maliciously, that the people who actually mattered already knew the truth. Deja let that sit for a moment, and then said something I carried with me straight into that ballroom 2 weeks later. The people who actually matter, knowing the truth, doesn't undo the cost of everyone else believing the smaller version. You're allowed to want both, Renata. You're allowed to want the truth known widely, not just held quietly by the 4 or 5 people who already respect you. I never made a scene about it. In 14 years of service, I learned exactly when a fight is worth having and when it isn't, and correcting my husband at a 4th of July barbecue never felt like the hill worth taking. I told myself, the way I told myself about so many things, that being underestimated cost me nothing, that the people who actually mattered, the men I'd served beside, the 2 soldiers who were alive because of that Kandahar night, knew exactly what had happened, and that was enough. Here's what I hadn't accounted for. Desmond's firm, Ferris and Whitcomb Insurance Group, had decided to host its annual Client Appreciation Gala that year with a specific Veterans Day theme. A full evening built around honoring service members among the firm's clients and staff. Complete with a keynote from a retired 2-star general the firm had flown in as the guest of honor. Desmond had been excited about the event for weeks, mentioning more than once, with a kind of casual pride I found almost sweet, that his own father's guard service would probably come up in his toast to the room. Here's what nobody in that ballroom knew yet. The retired 2-star general the firm had flown in as guest of honor, Major General Thomas Vance, had been my brigade commander during my 2nd Afghanistan deployment. He had personally signed the recommendation for my Bronze Star with Valor, and he had recognized me the moment he walked into that ballroom, 20 minutes before Desmond ever opened his mouth. The evening started ordinary enough. Cocktail hour, the string quartet the firm always hired for these things, Desmond moving through the room, shaking hands with clients, his hand occasionally finding the small of my back to steer me toward another introduction. I'd chosen the black dress carefully that morning, and I remember standing in front of our bedroom mirror thinking, with a flicker of something close to hope, that maybe tonight, of all nights, given the evening's actual theme, Desmond might finally introduce me the way I'd always wanted to be introduced. Not corrected, not softened, just accurately. Harlan Whitcomb's firm had gone all in on the Veterans Day theme, and I noticed, moving through the room, small folded cards at several tables listing the branch and years of service for clients who'd opted to share that information in advance. A genuinely thoughtful touch that made me wonder, briefly, whether Desmond had submitted anything on my behalf. He hadn't. My table's card simply read his name and title, no mention of me at all, and I told myself that was an oversight rather than anything more pointed, the way I'd told myself about so many small omissions over 4 years. I stood near the bar with a glass of club soda, watching my husband work a room he was genuinely good at working, and I felt, as I often did at these events, a kind of comfortable invisibility. Not unhappy, exactly, just quietly separate from the version of the evening everyone else was having. It happened during the pre-dinner toasts, when one of Desmond's senior partners, a booming, well-meaning man named Harlan Whitcomb, raised a glass to the room and asked if any veterans present wanted to share a word about their service before General Vance's keynote. A few hands went up around the room, an accountant who'd done a tour in the Navy, a client's son back from the Marines, and each of them said a few humble words that the room applauded warmly. Then Harlan, scanning the room, said, "Desmond, didn't you mention your family's got some military history too?" Desmond lit up, the way he always did with an audience, and pulled me slightly forward by the elbow, presenting me to the room like a piece of good news. "My wife actually served," he said, smiling. 14 years, if you can believe it." A few polite murmurs of approval moved through the crowd, and for one brief second, I thought this might actually be the moment Desmond finally described my service accurately, in front of people who genuinely respected it. Then Harlan, warm and curious, asked, "Combat deployments, or more of the support side?" And Desmond, without missing a beat, without a flicker of hesitation, said, "Mostly the support side, I think. You know, not like a real deployment, not out kicking down doors or anything." He laughed, an easy, affectionate laugh, the kind you'd use about a spouse's minor eccentric hobby. "You don't know what a real deployment is like, honey. Let the men talk," he added, turning back toward Harlan and the accountant with the Navy tour, already moving the conversation along. The room chuckled, not cruelly. That's the part that always surprises people who haven't lived inside a moment like this. Nobody in that ballroom meant harm. They simply had no reason to question a husband's easy, confident description of his own wife, delivered with the casual authority of someone who assumed he actually knew what he was talking about. The accountant with the Navy tour, a soft-spoken man named Preet, actually turned partway toward me with a polite, sympathetic smile, the kind you'd offer someone whose contribution had just been gently, generously minimized, and I remember thinking, distantly, that even his kindness in that moment was built on the same flattened premise Desmond had just handed the room. I didn't say anything. I stood there in my black dress with my club soda, and I felt something in me that had absorbed 4 years of small mischaracterizations go very still and very clear, the way still water goes clear right before it's disturbed. I didn't have to say anything, as it turned out, because General Vance had been standing near the edge of that circle for the last 30 seconds, having just arrived from greeting the firm's founding partner, and I watched his face shift the moment he registered what he'd just overheard. "Renata Osei," he said, and the whole circle turned toward him, because a 2-star general's voice carries differently in a room than an insurance broker's does. "Major Osei, I didn't know you'd be here tonight." I want to describe what happened on Desmond's face in that exact moment, because I've thought about it many times since. It was the particular, specific confusion of a man watching two pieces of information that had never before occupied the same space in his head, suddenly, violently collide. "You two know each other?" Harlan asked, delighted, clearly sensing a good story. "Know each other," General Vance repeated, and there was something almost incredulous in his voice, the tone of a man deciding how much restraint to exercise in a room full of civilians. "Major Osei served under my command in Afghanistan. Second deployment, she ran intelligence for my brigade during some of the hardest months we had out there." He paused, looking directly at Desmond now, not unkindly, but with the flat clarity of a commander laying out facts. "She's also the reason 2 of my soldiers are alive today. I signed the paperwork for her Bronze Star with valor myself, after she pulled Sergeant Alvarez and Specialist Diaz out of a burning vehicle under fire outside Kandahar. I don't think support side quite covers what your wife did over there, Desmond." The circle had gone very quiet. Harlan's mouth had actually fallen slightly open. Desmond stood there holding his drink, the color draining slowly from his face, the same particular shade of realization I imagine most people wear the first time they understand, in real time, exactly how wrong they've been about something they'd never once bothered to question. "I didn't," Desmond started, and then stopped, because there wasn't really a sentence that finished that thought in a way that made him look any better. General Vance continued, and I could tell, watching him, that some part of him had decided the room deserved the fuller picture, not out of any desire to embarrass Desmond specifically, but because he had spent 30 years watching good soldiers get quietly erased by exactly this kind of casual civilian assumption, and he seemed, in that moment, unwilling to let it happen again in front of him. "The vehicle had already taken a secondary hit by the time she reached it," he said, to the room now, not just to Desmond. "Fire climbing the frame. She got the door open by hand after it jammed, pulled Alvarez clear, went back in for Diaz, with the fire already spreading. I've read a lot of after-action reports in my career. Hers is one I still think about." Preet, the accountant with the Navy tour, had gone very still, and I watched him look at me with an expression entirely different from the polite, sympathetic smile he'd offered minutes earlier, something closer to genuine, recalculating awe. Harlan set his drink down on a passing tray, without seeming to notice he'd done it. General Vance turned to me then, and his voice softened into something warmer, something that had nothing to do with correcting anyone, and everything to do with genuine respect. "It's good to see you, Major. I've thought about that night more times than I can count. How's Alvarez doing these days?" He's good, sir, I said. Coaching his daughter's soccer team in Tampa. Sends me a picture every Christmas. Good man, General Vance said, and then, to the room at large, in the easy, commanding tone of someone accustomed to being listened to. This woman ran some of the most dangerous intelligence operations I oversaw in 11 years of command, and she did it better than most officers I've served with in 30 years total. I'd be careful selling her short in front of me, or in front of anyone who actually knows what real service looks like. The room, which moments earlier had chuckled warmly at Desmond's easy dismissal, had shifted into something closer to stunned silence, followed by a low murmur of genuine, recalculating respect. Harlan, recovering first, said, "Renata, I had no idea. That's remarkable." And I watched three other partners drift closer, suddenly curious about the woman they'd spent 4 years politely nodding past at company events. One of them, a senior partner named Louise Abernathy, who'd exchanged maybe a dozen words with me across 4 years of these galas, actually took my hand in both of hers and said, quietly, "I'm so sorry we never asked." I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't triumph, not exactly. It was something quieter and heavier, a kind of tired relief, the specific relief of finally having the truth land in a room without my having to fight for it myself. I hadn't orchestrated any of it. I hadn't planned to use General Vance's presence as leverage over my own husband. I'd simply stood there, holding my club soda, and let a truth that had always existed finally surface on its own timeline, in front of the one person whose word Desmond would never think to question. General Vance's keynote came about 20 minutes later, and I want to describe it because it added its own strange, public layer to the whole evening. He'd clearly planned to speak generally about the firm's clients who'd served, a warm, general appreciation of sacrifice, the kind of speech these events always feature. But partway through, he paused, looked out at the room, and said, "I want to tell you about something I witnessed personally, because I think it says more about real service than anything I'd planned to say tonight." He told the room, in more detail than he'd offered the small circle earlier, about the Kandahar convoy, about the 11 seconds between pulling one soldier clear and going back for the second, about what it actually looks like when someone's training and character meet a moment that has no script. He didn't use my name at first, letting the story stand on its own, and I watched the room lean in, entirely unaware, for a moment, that the officer he was describing was the same woman standing quietly near the back with a glass of club soda. "That officer is here tonight," he said finally, and every head in that ballroom turned toward me at once, an experience I can only describe as deeply disorienting after 4 years of being the person nobody thought to ask a follow-up question. Major Renata Osei. I'd ask you all to join me in actually honoring her, the way this evening is supposed to honor people who've served, instead of just nodding politely past them at the bar. The applause that followed was long and genuine, and entirely unlike the polite, distracted clapping I'd absorbed at 4 years of these same galas. I stood there, in my black dress, holding a glass of club soda I still hadn't finished, and I felt something in my chest finally unclench that I hadn't fully realized had been clenched for years. Desmond found me an hour later, near the end of the keynote, standing near a window, away from the main crowd. He looked shaken in a way I'd genuinely never seen from him before. 4 years of easy confidence momentarily stripped away. "Why didn't you ever correct me?" he asked, quietly. "All this time, why did you let me say things like that in front of people?" "I did correct you," I said. "At our engagement dinner, I told your uncle exactly what I'd done. You called it getting technical. I told myself after that, correcting you every single time would make me the difficult one, so I stopped. I let it slide because I told myself it cost me nothing. Tonight, I finally understood how wrong that was. I always thought," he started, and stopped, running a hand over his face. "I think I built some version of your service in my head that was easier for me to sit with. Easier than actually imagining you pulling people out of a burning vehicle under fire. If I really let that sink in, I think some part of me would have had to sit with how scared I'd have been for you every single day you were over there, and I think it was simpler to just decide it wasn't as serious as it actually was." I sat with that admission for a long moment, because it was more honest than anything he'd said to me in 4 years of marriage. "That might be true," I said. "But you didn't just soften it for yourself, Desmond. You said it out loud, in rooms full of people, as fact. You told your uncle I did admin work. You told Harlan I wasn't kicking down doors. Every time, you weren't protecting your own feelings quietly. You were deciding, publicly, what my life was worth. without ever once asking me first. He didn't have an answer for that, because there wasn't a good one, and I watched him understand, standing at that window, with the party still murmuring behind us, that the cost of his comfortable, softened version of my service hadn't been paid by him at all. It had been paid by me, 4 years running, every time I'd stood quietly in a room while he told people a smaller story than the one I'd actually lived. I called Deja the next morning, still half stunned by how the whole evening had unfolded, and I told her everything. General Vance's arrival, the 11 seconds, the applause, Desmond crying at the window. She was quiet for a long moment on the line, and then she said, "You know what strikes me most about that story? You didn't do anything. You didn't plan it. You didn't engineer it. You didn't even open your mouth until he was already crying. The truth just showed up in a general's uniform because it had been waiting for the right room the whole time." I think that's the part you need to actually sit with, Renata. Not that it happened dramatically. That it happened at all, finally, after 4 years of you deciding it wasn't worth the fight. "I keep thinking about what you said before the gala," I told her, "about being allowed to want the truth known widely, not just held by the people who already respect me." "And?" she asked. "And I think I spent 4 years telling myself the fight wasn't worth having because I was protecting Desmond's comfort," I said. "I don't think I was protecting anything. I think I was just avoiding a conversation that needed to happen a long time before some ballroom forced it into the open." We talked for a long time that night, longer than we had about almost anything in our marriage. I told him about Kandahar, in real detail, for the first time, the heat, the smoke, the sound the Marat made, Alvarez's face when I got the door open, the 11 seconds it took to decide whether going back for Diaz was worth what it might cost. Desmond cried, quietly, standing at that window, not performing anything for anyone, just finally, 4 years late, letting the actual weight of what I'd lived through land on him the way it should have landed long before that ballroom ever forced the issue. Word of that gala traveled faster than I expected, in the small, overlapping circles of Columbus's business community, and within a week, 2 of my own consulting clients had mentioned hearing about it secondhand, and my business partner, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priyanka Suresh, brought it up over coffee, with a look I hadn't seen from her in the 3 years we'd worked together. "I've known you 3 years, Renata," she said. "I knew you'd served. I don't think I ever fully understood what that actually meant, until my cousin, who was at that gala, texted me the whole story." She paused, stirring her coffee slowly. "I want you to know something. I've been quietly recommending you to clients for years, specifically because you read risk better than anyone I've ever worked with. This instinct you have for spotting the thing that's about to go wrong before anyone else sees it. I always figured that came from just being naturally sharp. I don't think I ever connected it to the actual years you spent learning to read exactly that kind of danger for real, with real consequences. I think I've been quietly underselling you too, in my own way, just by never asking." I told her what I'd told Deja, that I understood, better than most people, why it happens. Intelligence work, military service generally, is built to be invisible by design. Nobody claps for the convoy that didn't hit the IED because someone flagged the pattern 2 days earlier. You only ever hear about the moments that go wrong, and even then, usually filtered through someone else's account rather than your own. I'd spent 14 years training myself not to need the applause, and in some ways, I'd carried that same instinct straight into my marriage and my second career, quietly doing extraordinary work and expecting, without ever quite admitting it to myself, that the quality of the work alone would eventually make the recognition unnecessary. "It shouldn't have taken a 2-star general walking into a company gala for any of us to actually ask you the right questions," Priyanka said. "I'm sorry it took that long. I don't intend to let it take that long again. Things have shifted since that night, in ways that feel real, rather than performed." Desmond went with me, the following spring, to Alvarez's daughter's soccer tournament in Tampa, and I watched him shake Alvarez's hand and actually listen, for once, to the details Alvarez offered about that night, instead of filing them away into some softened, comfortable version he could repeat more easily at parties. Alvarez, for his part, pulled Desmond aside at one point, near the concession stand, and I watched the 2 of them talk for almost 20 minutes, out of earshot, and when Desmond came back to sit beside me in the bleachers, his eyes were red in a way that told me Alvarez had given him something I hadn't been able to give him myself. The account of that night, from the perspective of the man whose life had actually depended on those 11 seconds. "He told me what it sounded like," Desmond said quietly, watching Alvarez's daughter take the field. The fire. He said you didn't hesitate once, not for a second, and that everyone in that vehicle knew, the second you got the door open, that they were going to make it out. He said he thinks about you every single day, still, 4 years later. I didn't say anything. I just took his hand, and we watched the game. Gerald, Desmond's father, took longer to come around, in his own particular way. At the following 4th of July, the same gathering where Desmond had once dismissed my service as admin mostly, Gerald pulled me aside on the back porch, drink in hand, and told me gruffly that he'd heard the whole story from Desmond and that he wanted to say something. I always figured my 2 summers with the Guard were something to be proud of, he said, and they were, in their way. But I think I taught my son that service was mostly about the stories you get to tell afterward. I never taught him that some people come home carrying something a lot heavier than a good story, and that the heaviest ones are usually the last people willing to talk about it at a party. It wasn't quite an apology, not in so many words, but from Gerald, it was as close as I imagine I was ever going to get, and I've decided that's enough. Desmond stopped introducing me at gatherings at all now, actually. He simply lets me introduce myself, in my own words, at my own pace, which has turned out to be the single most respectful thing he could have done. At the firm's gala this past year, when a new client asked what I did, Desmond simply said, "That's actually a great question for Renata to answer herself," and stepped back, and I watched him listen, fully, without once softening a single word I said. I should tell you about Diaz, too, because his part of that night matters as much as Alvarez's, even though he features less in the story people usually want to hear. Specialist Diaz left the army 2 years after Kandahar, struggled for a while with the kind of invisible aftermath that doesn't show up in any after-action report, and eventually found steady work as an HVAC technician outside Phoenix. He and I talk maybe twice a year, usually around the anniversary of that night, and when he heard, through Alvarez, about the gala, he sent me a message that I've kept saved on my phone ever since. "I heard your husband finally knows," he wrote. "About time. I've been telling that story to anyone who'll listen for 4 years. Glad someone finally told it to the person who needed to hear it most." I wrote back and told him I was glad he was doing okay, and he sent back a photo of his 2 kids in front of a Christmas tree, the same ritual Alvarez kept. 2 men who'd survived something together and had quietly built entire lives afterward that neither of them ever needed anyone's applause to validate. I think about that ballroom often, the exact moment Desmond told me I didn't know what a real deployment was like. 2 feet away from me, in front of a room full of his colleagues. What strikes me most, looking back, is that I never once had to raise my voice to correct it. I didn't need to. The truth had simply been waiting in that room the whole time, standing in a general's dress uniform 20 feet away, ready to speak the moment it was finally given room to. I've thought, too, about what would have happened if General Vance hadn't been there that night, if the truth had simply stayed folded into 4 more years of admin mostly and polite distracted nodding. I don't think I would have stayed silent forever. I think, eventually, something else would have cracked it open. A different room, a different witness, maybe just my own accumulated exhaustion finally reaching its limit on some ordinary Tuesday that had nothing to do with a gala at all. I've come to believe that truths built on something as solid as 11 seconds and a burning vehicle don't actually need grand rooms or 2-star generals to eventually surface. They just need someone, somewhere, willing to finally stop softening them for the comfort of the person listening. General Vance reached out about a month after the gala, inviting Desmond and me to dinner, along with his wife, a warm, sharp-eyed woman named Colleen, who'd spent 30 years as an army spouse herself, and had clearly seen versions of this exact dynamic play out more times than she could count. Over dinner, Colleen told Desmond, gently but directly, about the particular loneliness of being married to someone whose most defining experiences you can never fully share, and how the healthiest military marriages she'd witnessed over 3 decades were the ones where the civilian spouse stopped trying to translate that experience into something smaller and more familiar, and instead simply made room for the parts they'd never fully understand. "You don't have to know what it was like," she told him. "You just have to stop deciding you already do." Desmond was quiet for most of that dinner, listening in a way I hadn't seen from him before, and on the drive home, he told me he'd been thinking, ever since the gala, about how much of his life he'd spent needing to be the one who understood things fully, needing to have an answer or a framework ready before anyone else in the room did, and how that instinct, applied to something like my service, had made him reach for the smallest, most manageable version Instead of sitting with the discomfort of admitting there were things about his own wife he simply didn't understand. I think I've been doing that with a lot of things, he admitted. Not just this. I think I need to actually work on that, not just around you. If you've ever had someone who loves you tell your own story smaller than it actually was, I hope you remember this. You don't have to fight every single mischaracterization in the moment it happens. Sometimes, the truth is patient enough to wait for the right room, the right witness, the right night. And when it finally speaks, it speaks louder than any argument you could have made alone. But I also want to be honest about the other half of that lesson, the half I only fully understood afterward, talking it through with Deja. Patience isn't the same thing as permission. I let 4 years pass, telling myself the truth would eventually find its own room, and it very nearly didn't. It took a two-star general's unplanned attendance at an insurance firm's holiday gala, a genuine coincidence I had no hand in engineering, for that truth to finally surface in front of the people who needed to hear it. I don't think everyone gets that kind of coincidence handed to them. Some truths wait their whole lives for a room that never quite arrives, and the people carrying them are left wondering whether staying quiet was patience or simply cost, dressed up to look like virtue. I've decided, since that night, that I'm no longer willing to leave that question to chance. I tell my own story now, plainly, the first time anyone asks, in my own words, whether or not a general happens to be standing nearby. My father, watching all of this unfold from Columbus, 4 hours away, called me the week after the gala and told me he'd finally gotten the thing he'd hoped for in that parking lot 20 years earlier. Someone in a position of real authority, publicly, unmistakably, saying exactly what he'd always believed about his daughter. It shouldn't have taken this long, he said, but I'm glad it happened while I'm still here to see it. I told him I was glad too, and I meant it more than I think he fully understood. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story meant something to you, drop a comment below and subscribe to Silent Revenge for more stories about the quiet people who finally get to be seen exactly as they are. I'll see you in the next one.